At its very core, drug science must remain independent. This means we don't accept sponsorships. It's with the support of the drug science community we're able to do this and make the podcast in the first place. If you're able to become a drug science community member and support the show, you too will be supporting the dissemination of evidence-based drug policies. Without you, none of this would be possible. For anybody interested, there's a link in the show notes. Thank you. Hello and welcome to the Drug Science Podcast with me, David Nutt. Here we're bringing together experts and activists for a rational, honest and informed conversation about drugs. Hello and welcome to another Drug Science Podcast. Today I have with me Zoe Cormier. She's not to be confused with the American versions. She's a Canadian. She's a Canadian author. She's a journalist. She's a broadcaster and soon to be a podcaster. And most of you who've come across her will have come across her because of her book, Sex, Drugs and Rock and Roll, which was published 12 years ago now. And I think it was probably how we met. I think you might have picked my brain a little on the aspects of that book. Is that right, Zoe? Can you remember?
Yes, sir, actually. So I got my contract to write the book 12 years ago, but then it was 10 years ago that it was published in the UK. By the way, also published in North America, Spain, and Sweden. My Swedish publisher is Bjorn from ABBA, who is very passionate. He's very passionate about publishing humanistic books that explore concepts from a scientific perspective rather than religious. But it was more the music side of things he was into. But I started writing the proposal for that book way back in 2012, and I initially only wanted to write about music. So I actually grew up in the music industry. My father is a rock promoter in Toronto, and my whole family works in the arts. And I kind of rebelled, kind of like Safi in Absolutely Fabulous, by embracing the world of science, which a lot of the airheads in my family just saw as technical and boring. They thought science was important for maybe finding vaccines or making new tools and cameras, but they didn't realize that science teaches you about what it means to be alive. And I loved biology. I was never into physics. For me, biology was what set my heart on fire. But I grew up in the music industry and I have a very, very deep, passionate love for music. So I initially wanted to write a book just about music. And my publisher said, why don't you write a book about sex, drugs, and music together? No one's written a scientific book about all three. So it was actually a natural fit for me. And I certainly had been interested and done many drugs since my teens, being a normal teenager and growing up in Canada. If you don't start smoking cannabis when you're 15, you kind of have to give up your passport. But I'd never wanted to write about drugs actually from a professional perspective because, I don't know, I just sort of was never drawn to it. Maybe it seemed like career suicide. It sort of had never really crossed my plate. But, I'd like to think I'm pretty good at it. I've published, since my book came out, articles in Rolling Stone. I'm the only person still alive who can say Rolling Stone paid them to take acid. I did that by listening to the music of Mendel Kaelin, who was your PhD student, for a big piece I wrote about that. I've written for Wired, New Scientist, Nature, the BBC, The Guardian, all the big ones. And I think that I do write about it well because I know the good and the bad. I grew up surrounded by drugs. My parents were very, ardent cannabis fans, shall we say. I worked at a nightclub. I've seen people under the influence of everything you can imagine. I've tried an awful lot of things. So I know how they can certainly mess you up in horrific ways. In fact, actually, just 2 weeks ago, I saw somebody at a nightclub freak out after taking psilocybin. And I hadn't seen anybody freak out on a psychedelic in a long time. He was fine, by the way, 3 hours later. I'd like to think because I had he said he wanted to try psychedelic. And I was like, have you done one before? And he's like, no. I said, don't do it now. You're in a noisy, tiny club. Like, do it in the rain, on a nice day with some friends that you trust in a park, or a forest. Don't do it now. And I said, if you're going to do it, then take psilocybin. It'll last 4 hours, not LSD, because that could last 8.
Well, I hope you introduced him to my book as well afterwards.
I should do that, actually. I mentioned that book. I mentioned that book to somebody, and someone said, oh, that book. The other day I saw an osteopath and he said, you know what I didn't realize when I booked you is I've read your book. And he said, I'm going to read it again. He said, I remembered it was very funny. But yeah, so that's when you and I first met, David. You very generously gave me an hour to talk to you about the whole world of narcotics and such, which is an incredibly generous thing to do for a first-time author that you'd never met before. I was very flattered. And do you recall, we spent most of the time arguing about the pharmaceutical industry, because understandably so, you were bored of just talking about ecstasy and MDMA, which you must still be very bored of talking about.
Well, of course, MDMA's come back into the forefront after the FDA decision the other week, which we're all still reeling from. But I guess you have thoughts on that.
Yeah. How do you feel about that decision? Because I actually know quite a few researchers who are for MDMA for PTSD and believe in it, but are actually not opposed to the FDA decision.
Yeah, well, I think that it's one of those examples that we should never have gotten to that position in the first place. I mean, the dialogue with the FDA has been going on for, I think, 14 years. So for those
14.
issues to have come up at the end as if they were not thought through and certainly not tabled a long time ago, I think it's actually an example of a major failure of the regulatory process, because the need was now as great as it was then. It was disappointing, to the very least, to have for it to have become a car crash when it was. It could have, I think this could all have been avoided.
Yeah, it is also really shocking because everybody really felt, I mean, they got to the third round, breakthrough therapy, all that. We all really, I mean, some researchers have said to me that they quietly feel that the issue, for example, that you spoke about, the lack of blinding, you know, people have long spoken about that, but there's also lots of other trials with other drugs where you can't blind
Well,
either.
exactly.
And it is probably fair to say that there's probably some evangelical belief on the part of some researchers that this works. However, there's evangelical belief on the part of lots of researchers in lots of fields that something is going to work, including particle physics and development of new forms of technology. Sometimes people slog away at it because they believe it's going to work. I'll give you an example. My mother, when she had lung cancer, was given the drug Keytruda, the form of immunotherapy that won the Nobel Prize. That took James Allison 25 years to create, and everyone told him he was insane. And it turned out that he wasn't insane, and if I could find him, I would give him the world's biggest kiss. My mother looked 15, maybe 20 years younger when she was on that drug. It is magic. And in fact, Lauren McDonald, who now works for you,
Well, no.
also had her
Lauren
life's.
is well exceeded my sphere of influence, but she's got it on the podcast. You can listen to her
I
podcast,
love
and
her.
she'll share
Yeah.
with you
Oh,
her
great.
recovery. Yes, for cancer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, she's told me all about it. She was on the same drug as my mother, and it would have saved my mother's life. She just started smoking way too young, like 10 years old. But James Allison wouldn't have done that if he didn't really know in his heart. Sometimes an emotional inspiration really is necessary for progress. I do think, however, that organizations such as MAPS Canada didn't do the field any favors when there was that very embarrassing video that was released of, yeah, I'm sure for the audience members who are listening, there was a trial looking at MDMA to treat PTSD. There was a woman whose therapists were a married couple who not only cuddled her and spooned her during the sessions, but also wound up having a sort of throuple love relationship with her, which we all
That
know
was after that was
breaks
after the sessions, I think.
afterwards. But you get sexual abuse and you get manipulative romantic behavior in lots of other forms of therapy too. But I guess because it was associated with a love drug, quote unquote,
Yes,
it really did make ripples as opposed to if they had all just been sober.
yes. I think it was always going to be a very steep climb for MDMA because there was there was such hostility to it in the beginning to getting it
Mm.
banned. I mean, I kind of slightly wonder whether if it had been approved, that would have undermined all the myths and falsehoods that have been shared over the last 30 years by NIDA and co. And it would have kind of undermined the whole basis of drug classification, which of course, we all know is completely flawed. But the people who affect it and pursue it and get paid to monitor it would not like that. So I think there was a lot of hidden agendas which were hostile to MDMA, which is I just find very, very disappointing for the vast number of people who would have benefited and who may never get it. I mean, it may never ever become a medicine now. Not in America. I mean, clearly it's a medicine in Australia, which is an interesting paradox. And I don't know whether no reason why Canada shouldn't go down the same route of compassionate use, is there?
It'll be interesting to see. I mean, one insight that I can give you. So I'm from Canada, but I moved here around like 2005. But when I first came here in 2003, I was really shocked at the difference in attitudes towards recreational drugs. So in Canada, cannabis was just seen as is very normalized, to put it mildly. And so obviously now we know it's the only G7 country where it's fully legal. But I grew up as a teenager hearing so many scare, like the media was always full of these horrific scare stories about how dangerous MDMA is. Although it's funny, they always refer to it as ecstasy, and there's often a confusion in the media over what ecstasy refers to, if it refers just to
Yeah.
MDMA, or are you talking about a pill that contains MDMA and other things. So, but there were lots of scare stories when I was a teenager about kids dying at raves. Very rarely was there ever a mention of the fact that those kids would have been dehydrated. And what is probably often the biggest factor is they haven't slept. And you don't know what's in those pills. You know, it could be rat poison. It could be, now we're getting fentanyl, of course, but it could also have been back in the day, all kinds of things. But the media scaremongering about ecstasy was so intense. I never tried it. In fact, I was terrified to try it because of all of that. I also used to work at raves in Canada as a bartender, and the music was called happy hardcore, which, if you know anything about dance music, it is the worst music in the world. And I thought, oh my God, if taking this drug makes you like that, I'm not taking it. But then I came to the UK, and no one ever talked about the dangers of MDMA. Instead, everybody was terrified the inducement of schizophrenia in teenagers who could be prone to schizophrenia. And I actually have a number of friends here that I'm still friends with who had seen that happen to a friend of theirs. And the evangelical belief here that cannabis can cause schizophrenia. I mean, look at Suella Braverman. She wanted to reclassify cannabis as a Class A drug. So it's really strange, though, because even though we speak the same language, the cultures are very different. And instead, people here, often spoke. Well, also people differentiated between skunk and other kinds of cannabis, which we don't do in Canada. We just talk about the strength of the weed. I didn't know what skunk meant, but people here often spoke about how raves in the 1990s in Manchester and so forth were so lovely because the pills were very strong, but people weren't drinking. And the cross-Atlantic difference in attitudes was fascinating because we're not that different. And Canada probably could, they could be progressive. I mean, if there's one thing Canadians love, there's two Canadian addictions. One is pointing out that someone who's American is actually Canadian, like Jim Carrey or whatever. It's the Canadian Tourette's. And because you can't tell, like
I
Leonard
couldn't tell.
Cohen's Canadian.
I didn't know that. Thank you.
Right, there you go. Like it's the Canadian Tourette's, is to point out who's famous, who's Canadian. But the other Tourette's that Canadians have is pointing out superiority to the Americans whenever they can. Now, caveat, I am not the biggest fan of many things that Canada has done, and we could talk about that for hours. My last book will be called Canada's Greatest Crimes, all the awful things that country has done that they get away with. And they get away with it because everybody thinks we're so
Oh, you
liberal
mean
and so
the native Indians? Yeah.
There's that, but I mean, there's lots of other things. Like, for example, all the uranium that was dropped on Hiroshima, that all came from the Arctic in Canada. But in the Arctic in Canada, they used the Inuits, the native people up there. They just told them to go into the caves and bring it back. They didn't give them safety equipment. And there was an outbreak of cancers. There was an outbreak of cancers there before the bombs were even dropped, I believe. They called themselves, or mostly like leukemia, but basically they called themselves the first victims of the atomic bomb. And the genetic link that they have to people in the far east of Asia, the sort of link in it hasn't escaped their attention. But there's lots of things that Canada has done that are really horrific that the world doesn't know about. And the world doesn't know about it. As one of my friends put it, it's easy to look pretty when you're standing next to the ugliest kid in school. But one thing to know about Canadians, and this is true of all Canadians, is we know America better than America knows itself, for a couple of reasons. So we grew up with the same television, the same pop culture, but we don't grow up with the American nationalism and that greatest country in the world thing. So we're more objective in that way, but we're also terrified of America. So back in the 1800s, pardon me, America was beholden to an idea called manifest destiny. Have you heard of that?
Yes, a little. Explain to those who haven't, though.
Sure. So the idea of manifest destiny was that it was America's destiny to take over all of Mexico and all of Canada, that entire continent would be theirs. And this really gained traction after the Civil War, partially because right after the Civil War, all the different parts of Canada, so there was Upper Canada and there was different regions, but they actually weren't one country. One of the things that made them become one country was that after the Civil War, America was angry as heck at England because the United Kingdom supported the South during the war. The United Kingdom sent ships because they wanted a reliable supply of cheap.
We wanted that cotton, didn't we? That's right, for our mills, yes.
Exactly, mill on the floss. They wanted to continue the suffering up in Yorkshire. So after the war, America was angry at the UK, but America also had a very large mobilized army that now had nothing to do. So one of the things that inspired all the different Canadian provinces to unite and form one nation was that they could protect themselves and remain independent of American influence. Thank God they did. But Canada has always been afraid of America, and Canada's always been afraid of America someday being able to roll over and take us over. Pierre Trudeau, the father of Justin Trudeau, always used the metaphor an elephant and a mouse. Like Canada is geographically huge, but the population's tiny, and 90% of the population lives within about 100 miles of the American border because it's the warmest parts. So we grew up paying very close attention to America, and we understand it better than it understands itself, and I stand by that. For example, I said Donald Trump would win in 2016. I said he's going to win. And all my British friends said, America's just stupid, but not that stupid. And I said, it's not about stupid. It's about fame. You think that money rules America? Nuh-uh. Fame rules America. But this election, I mean, we're missing a trick if we don't talk about it because it is really terrifying. The whole world can take 5 minutes to be smug and laugh at American naivety. But what this means for the climate, from somebody who said climate change is a hoax and he wants to shut down the EPA and the NOAA, what this means for Lebanon and Gaza, what this means for the Ukraine, the international implications. And also, if you looked on a lot of different international news networks just after the election, they said that in Brussels, all the right wingers, all the Orbans, all the Marie Le Pens, they're all rubbing their hands and they feel emboldened. So, the whole world laugh at. Obviously, they say if you bring up Hitler, you lose the argument, but it's still the same story. We can't just sit back and giggle. We have to pay attention to what this is going to do around the planet.
Yeah, well, let's continue that line. Let's explore a little bit how you think it might affect drug policy. Do you think he's going to make cannabis legal federally?
He might. I don't know. Okay, so first of all, there's really no point in trying to examine what Trump is planning or thinking because he has the attention of a fruit fly, and and what he says bounces around incoherently so quick. To suggest that he merely suffers from dementia would be a compliment. He doesn't suffer from dementia. He suffers from Donald. And he's always been like this. If you go back to speeches in the 80s, there's no attention span. He's really good at what Americans like, which is claiming to be successful when he's not. We all know that if he kept all the money that his real estate father left him, he just put it in a bank and did nothing but play golf, he'd have more money now. So he's not a good businessman. He's not good at anything. What he's really good at is lying. But he's also really good at stirring up people's emotions. And so much of American politics has always been driven by emotions. For example, people who liked Joe Biden, if you look at Joe Biden's policies on things like the Middle East, he's actually always been a war hawk. He's always actually been pretty uninspired and pretty conservative. He hasn't been progressive on things like abortion, but he has a great personal story. Who can't be moved by the story about his wife, his child getting killed by a drunk driver, and that's why he's teetotal, but you can't just say he looks like a good dude. That means he's going to be a good leader. But that's the American way. And they really dig their emotional link to these issues. They don't like talking about stats. They don't like talking about policies. And it's all, I think the really scary thing is it wasn't just that Trump appealed to people's emotions. And you have to admit, Make America Great Again is a great slogan if you're working in an Amazon warehouse and you're living in a tent and you can't even afford groceries without food stamps, despite the fact that you're employed. You would also think it's not a great country and it could be great again. But the scary thing is that he appealed to people's sense of rage and vengeance, that he appealed to the worst of them. Kamala Harris wanted the message of joy, and she said, let's get to work. Instead of having optimism and going to work, Americans actively, aggressively voted for the idea of vengeance. And they can't see just the clear, twisted irony in being so cruel to undocumented migrants and Mexicans when America has treated South America and Central America like its economic backyard for 100 years.
Oh, it's history. Who would ever teach history in America?
If I hadn't studied biology, I would have studied history, because as we all know, she who does not know her history is condemned to repeat it. But in terms of the world, and I'll try and keep this on a drugs track, because it is really important.
Please.
I do sometimes get bored of writing about drugs because I find the money people really boring. I feel like they're always lying to me, but I like talking to the scientists. And 12 years ago, it was always about the science and never about the history. It was always about the history and the science, but now it's just, I constantly have to follow the stock market and all those stupid tech bros who are ruining it. But in terms of drugs, let's look at what is Trump going to do? So first of all, he wants to give RFK Jr., who is the most insane person you could possibly
You better explain. Not everyone who listens to this podcast will be completely familiar with the Kennedy clan. Do you want to just...
So RFK Jr. would be the son of Robert Kennedy Sr., who was JFK's little brother, who was also assassinated. RFK Jr., however, broke with the family tradition of being intellectual and progressive. He has the worst thing that he did was being the biggest popularizer of the idea that vaccines cause autism, which has been debunked over and over and over and over and over. But once the horse is bolted, once the message was out there, people believed it, and you're now seeing an increase in measles and children dying of it. That's horrifying. It's only a matter of days, I think, until we start seeing polio in America.
Really?
So Trump has decided to give RFK Jr. a very prominent role in healthcare provision. So this is a guy who doesn't understand scientific evidence. He doesn't believe in scientific evidence. And the other person who Trump is going to give a big role to is Elon Musk, who most people are most familiar with for his incredibly toxic, destructive impact on the media, or also his cars that look like penises. In terms of drugs policy, Elon Musk is a very ardent user of ketamine for his mental health. And frankly, don't we all wish that Elon Musk had died instead of Matthew Perry? Wouldn't that have been great? I would have loved that. I kid, sort of, really, but the combination of, I think the biggest danger is the open distrust and disregard for scientific evidence. And America has.
Well, that's what the Kennedy man is arguing. He's not. I saw a tweet when he said he was going to get rid of the FDA. Seemed slightly whatever I think about them, that seemed a little bit excessive.
I mean, the FDA. I think that their reasons for, I actually don't really, I would never follow American drug policy with regards to anything to find a shining beacon for how we should progress. This is, very often it's determined by emotions and not evidence. And I think in the FDA's case, it actually wasn't the scientific evidence that they rejected. I think it was the emotional belief in the drug that they were distrustful of at the end of the day. I wasn't in those panels. I don't know. But my gut feeling, knowing what Americans are like, is that they didn't like how hard people were pressing for it with the advertising and the campaigns. They felt that it was more of a crusade rather than an evidence-based, which is fair, but that doesn't mean they're wrong. Just because they, again, going back to the emotional influence on science, but the biggest problem is the severe scientific illiteracy in America. And it's not that Americans are dumb, okay, but they don't fund education. Here's a fun fact, David. In Canada, in every province, what they do is they take the money for the secondary schools or the schools in general, and they divide it up evenly between districts. So I grew up in Chinatown. All the kids that I went to school with came from hardworking, poor immigrant families, but we studied Latin. We had an Olympic-sized swimming pool with top-quality laboratories with chemistry equipment. The schools in Canada are excellent because they don't let rich areas keep their money to themselves. In America, parents are obsessed with where they live so that can make sure they pick a good school. We don't have that stress where I come from. So you don't wind up with generation after generation after generation living in poor areas with awful schools. But if you do that, you do wind up with lots of people who don't understand what evidence means. They don't understand what a statistic means. They don't understand what really shows that a drug works or not. And people in America love anecdotes. They love stories. Even the politicians, when they sell things to people, they say things like, well, I met little Sally Joe who blah, blah, blah. They love those kinds of snapshot stories that stir the heart, but at the expense of the brain. And it doesn't mean that you should govern your life without using your heart, but you need to be able to take a step back and look at the evidence. And now we have RFK Jr. and Donald Trump steering American health policy. And the fact is that the rest of the world is going to pay attention either. I would say this is an example for the UK to do something very smug and actually approve MDMA. It would be a nice chance to do something progressive. And Keir Starmer is not the most inspired individual. As I say, way to put the accountant in charge of the revolution. But he's no dummy. He's no dummy. And this would be, if he could see the evidence, I think, he and anybody else.
We'll be banging that drum for both MDMA and for psilocybin.
By the way, did you think that the US was really going to do it first and that the UK would then have to follow suit?
Did I think that? Well, I was hoping someone would do it first. But the fact that Australia has is very, to me, that's actually quite a significant advance because I think they've now got 80 patients who have gone through this new scheme, and it'll gradually probably snowball. So I think that'll feed back quite well. The evidential feedback, and this is real world evidence, will be, I think, in the end, will encourage other countries to do the same. So we will be pushing for something similar in the UK in the new year, and I think there are people in Labour who are sympathetic to that. Yeah.
Although it's tricky, and also interestingly, like Labor have said that they would like to eventually make tobacco illegal for people under 18 to buy. You're going to be surprised to hear that, but hear this because my mother died of lung cancer from 50 years of smoking. I'm not in favor of that. Well, first of all, in Native American and Canadian cultures, smoking tobacco communally is a peace ritual. It's something that's indigenous. So it's first of all, it's kind of a colonial attitude to not recognize the legitimate use of this plant by other cultures in ways. You can have tobacco at a peace pipe ceremony that's very different to chain smoking 50 Marlboro cigarettes a day, which, there's a very different way to use it. And I'm also not in favor of just outright prohibiting tobacco, because if you make something forbidden fruit, then kids are going to want to get it. That's the way it works. And, I'm not sure what I think. I don't know if I think that mushrooms should be on sale in a pharmacy. I do think that psychedelics and ketamine and sometimes even cannabis, actually, I'm not sure if I'm all for the willy-nilly anybody can have it, fully legal route. But the legislation and how you regulate access to these things is really tricky. And I'm not sure I have the answer, but I just know that if they make it fully illegal, it's going to make kids want it more.
And also, criminalizing kids is just generally not a good thing to do. It doesn't help.
Yes, it's also worth pointing out that you can get lung cancer from combusting any plant because they release dioxins. It's not just tobacco that causes it. So there's lots of people in North America, and I used to be one of them, who just would smoke just pure cannabis. But that can also give you lung cancer for the same reasons, because it contains all that smoke and combustible chemical.
Well, look, you're not on this program to give us the answers. You're on this program to share thoughts, and but you haven't explained to us why you're in England or the UK.
Oh, why am I in England? Well, my mother was born here. So my grandfather was an actor, and he was acting in the West End of London when my mom was born. So we both have passports just by birthright. But I grew up in Canada. But then my mother moved back here in 2002, and she and my father split up when the kids were grown up. And as soon as I got here, I always knew it was home growing up. I grew up on Monty Python, and I even have a letter that Roald Dahl wrote to me, a fan letter that he wrote to me when he was, I wrote him a fan letter when I was 8 years old, and he wrote back, and he actually died a month after I got the letter, because he spent all of his time in hospital as he was dying replying to his fan mail. So I've always been I've just always.
You're an intellectual Brit, an emotional Brit, huh? Are you?
Well, there's lots of us, and by the way, America, you guys bang on about the dreamers, the undocumented children of migrants. There are a lot of Americans in Europe and England who have given up their citizenship in America because they don't want it, because you still have to pay taxes in America. But it's honestly like, I just love the people in England. I just do. I've always loved British culture and music. And as soon as I moved here, I instantly found dozens of friends. There are tons of people who, I hope some will be listening to this, who were my friends 25 years ago and are still my friends. I just love British people. You guys make me laugh. And yes, it's too gray in the winter. And yes, it's expensive and X, Y, and Z. But it's the cultural density. I mean, when one is tired of London, one is tired of life. Go. And, I've had fun in New York. I've had fun in Los Angeles. I just never, ever dreamed of living there or wanted to live there. I just love the people here. And in particular, because I love music so much, I saw a documentary about Glastonbury when I was 15. And I promised I'd go before I was 25. And I went when I was 20. And the button was set. I was like, I'm never living anywhere else. I mean, maybe I'll live in Amsterdam or Rome or something for a year, but this is home. But I just love the people. And I'm very, very grateful for my passport. And I do have a lot of fear for the whole world, though. It's going to be weird, isn't it? The first meeting between Keir Starmer and Trump, eh?
Yeah, well, I want to stick to something other than politics. We've done enough politics for that. We've only got about 20 minutes left. We could dissolve in American politics. So I want to talk to you more about science. I mean, you've written, as you've said, quite a lot. I remember you were when we published our very first imaging paper on LSD, you wrote an article for Nature about it. What is it about this particular line of research that you find most appealing?
That's a good question. Well, so I actually was the first journalist to read that paper where you looked at what happens in the brain under the influence of LSD. Well, I'm really bored by law. It's just a made up language, and we could have a revolution tomorrow and all the rules would be changed. But biology is art. And when you look at how these molecules influence the brain, I mean, how could you not be fascinated by it, that a chemical can change the way you think and feel? Whether you're talking about an SSRI or a psychedelic, that is pretty bananas, and it's fascinating. Why am I still keen to? Because it is still important, I mean, I had a cousin when I was a kid who committed suicide when I was very young. And even though I really am not a fan of ketamine, he would have been one of those individuals who, if he was given it for the rapid antidepressant relief, maybe he'd still be alive,
Good point. Yeah.
Yeah. So every drug is a double-edged sword. Whether you're talking about caffeine, sugar, right? It's no one thing is totally benign or entirely bad. It's just about how you use it, when and where. And there's unfortunately a real lack of nuance in the public understanding of that. They want to split things into good and bad, right and wrong, and it's not that simple.
So you're currently, how do you balance your life? You write about music still? I'm not sure. Obviously, I read your science stuff, but you write about...
Well, I certainly do write about music, but very often from a scientific perspective. So I wrote a piece recently and gave a huge talk at a couple of conferences about archaeoacoustics, which is the study of how ancient spaces were built and positioned for the acoustics. So for example, cave art is very often found at points inside the cave that have the loudest acoustics. So they were using the cave art as like X marks the spot. But also you find... But also you find that a lot of ancient theaters like the Acropolis, they have incredible acoustic properties, and it's a really neat field to understand the importance of sound to the human condition. So I still write about a huge range of things. I've just started doing a lot of writing about something called synthetic biology, which is using algae and bacteria to produce things like drugs, fuels, fertilizers. I think it's really cool. I actually started my career, Sarah, writing about environmental issues for just 5 years. I interviewed Jane Goodall, for example, when I was 24. Right. That was actually my main... I actually would never have done anything else. I wanted to spend my whole life being a specialist reporter on environmental issues, and it still is where my heart lies. I actually wrote my thesis in university on acoustic communication in amphibians, and I did a lot of research on the acoustic communication of cetaceans, and I just love living things. I think they're fascinating and beautiful.
So you're a true biologist. You have a broad biological interest.
Definitely. I'm definitely a biologist. Biologists always have really big memories for just huge amounts of words and facts. But I'm not a scientist by training. I never wanted to be a scientist.
Well, you did a PhD, you just said.
I don't have a PhD, and I couldn't be bothered to spend 5 years writing something that 3 people would read. Why would I spend 5 years writing a book that 3 people would read? I spent 3 years writing a book that about 5,000 people have read, so that's what I wanted to do. Yeah. But if you care about living things, then you care about... You have to focus on environmental issues because we're going through the great extinction and climate change. I mean, this is why a Trump victory is the scariest thing. So I write about a lot of stuff, but right now, as you mentioned, I have a new podcast, and there is actually an insertion of drugs in that story. So I was writing a piece about using music for psychedelic therapy with MDMA and LSD and so forth. And I discovered through my friends that Max Cooper, the techno artist, was making music at the time for a company called Small Pharma, who were looking at DMT for depression. And I lost my mind because I was a huge Max Cooper fan. So I got an introduction to him through the people who run Small Pharma. And I didn't realize before meeting him, he has a PhD in genetics. He actually wanted to be a scientist. And then when he got his PhD, the recession hit and he couldn't get a job. So he tried his hand at music instead. But he also has a music label called Mesh. And Mesh... I didn't realize this, and tons of artists on the label, such as a guy named Indian Wells, who makes really great, filthy Italian techno, Rival Consoles. There were already tons of musicians on there that I was already a huge fan of, and a lot of them are scientists by training. So Rob Clouth, for example, studied particle physics. A lot of them are scientists, but who make techno instead. So when I met Max, we talked about genetics for an hour before we talked about music. And I struck up a really great rapport with him and his managers. And now I work for them as the head of the official podcast, which is exploring the intersection of art, music, and science. So it's just in production right now. So it's not live yet, but it's an absolute thrill. And I mean, basically my life's mission really wraps up nicely with this podcast is that I've just always, it's kind of like I haven't stopped being the 8-year-old girl or the teenager that I was as a child who was desperately trying to make all the airhead artists in her family understand that science is beautiful. And I'm still basically banging that drum.
Yeah, I think music's an interesting bridge, isn't it, between art and science? I mean, certainly at a simplistic level, there's frequencies and...
Yeah, no, but it's more than that. I mean, in the Renaissance era, art and science were not seen as disparate disciplines. They were seen as, for example, different ways of understanding mathematics, and music was a way of uniting all of them. But, it is the anti-science, how do I put this? The increasing frequency of anti-scientific declarations in America is very, very worrying, but it's also depressing. This is a huge population of people who just aren't being given the chance to see what a beautiful tool it is to understand the beauty of the universe. And how can you look at these things? And science just means you're taking a step back and you're trying to put aside your biases and you're trying to just look at the data that's there and to see what could be there that you can't see. And yeah, it does all wrap up very nicely. But yeah, I think I would share with you something that my first year biology professor at the University of Toronto, he was a botanist and his name is Spencer Barrett, and he ended his lecture series with biology is art. Don't ever forget that.
Well, certainly, definitely, yes. As you slice through those branches of trees and see the artwork in leaves, and yes, exactly, yeah, no, at every level, yes.
It's art, and it's also, I mean, like, we don't have time to get into this, but if there's one major thing there's two things I would want to change in America for the whole world to benefit from. One is make your education system better and stop barfing all over scientists and grinding them into the dirt and calling them nerds. I hate that show, Big Bang Theory. Like, science is a beautiful thing that we use to understand the world and make it a better world. But the other thing is we need to clamp down on the tech bros in the technology industry because they will destroy anything they can. They will destroy the books industry. They will destroy music. They will destroy movies. And now they're also ruining the psychedelic sphere. You have tons of startups run by these tech bros, and they're not invested in it for anything more than the cash. And if that's your only goal is to make a lot of money, that's never going to marry well with medicine. And it's going to go very badly for everybody.
No, I would very much agree with you there. I mean, that is why I've been supporting initiatives like the My Medicine Australia initiative, trying to find alternative providers for necessary therapies.
Absolutely. And I have a lot of friends who would be dead if it wasn't for psychedelic therapy. It absolutely is the real deal. But when people are having it shoved down their throats by the like of Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and countless other vacuous bimbos from San Francisco, it just does not bode well.
So how are we going to promote this alternative view then? I mean, are you writing, I mean, are you going to do it just through podcasts, or you've got another book coming up? You know?
My new book. I can't say too much about my new book because it's in the works. I had to put the project on pause for a while because my mother died of cancer, and I said to my publisher, I need a couple of years before I'm ready to do this. But drugs will always be part of my research and part of my thinking. Like, even for example, the word addiction, I find fascinating, and I would like to write about more because it's a really dirty word. And I have a lot of friends who have been addicted to heroin, ketamine, sugar, caffeine, like you name it. I have friends who've been addicted to it. Ketamine destroyed my friends more than anything, ketamine. But in my experience, people who have addiction issues to drugs are usually just very thoughtful people who think and feel too much. And for a lot of them, the weight of their ambition or the weight of their worries. I knew a lot of people in journalism who were very heavy cocaine fiends, but that's because they were so ambitious and they were going to report in war zones in Lebanon, And it's interesting, there's, Juliana Mulligan, I think she's been on this with you. So she said that she really feels that the idea that drug addictions and alcohol addictions are different to other addictions she's over it. And in my opinion, the worst addiction is money and power. Like, look at Jeff Bezos. How many industries are you willing to destroy? How many people are you willing to make homeless and destitute for another billion, So, yeah, I will always be writing about drugs because it is a subject that is close to my heart for a lot of personal reasons. But also it's, I have a minor form of epilepsy. It is just hard. I mean, I've spoken to my neurologist repeatedly saying the only medication I want to think about is based on cannabis and the dismissive attitude that they have. And in fact, actually, they say there's not enough evidence, which is just unscientific.
Oh, well, you'll be pleased to know. Today, we've just submitted a paper to the British Journal of Hospital Medicine. They asked us to write a paper on cannabis for epilepsy, which is great.
Excellent.
That's a journal that's read by a lot of trainee doctors. So,
good, because that's the thing is that doctors are human too, and they don't have time to read all the journals and all the meta studies, right? So they also need, and they will often just see the headlines that they see, and it's horrifying to me. I still have spoken to scientists in America and Canada who are adamant that ecstasy can kill you. And just as I've also repeatedly found with medical doctors here, they just don't want to accept cannabis. It's really weird.
And yes, it can become self-fulfilling, doesn't it? Because if they don't get taught about it, or they don't get any evidence given to them, or they don't meet patients who've responded. there's no reason to change their prejudice.
Yes, there's that, and which is also where the world of science communication and because you got everybody. We all have to keep in mind that nobody has the time. If I could spend all day every day reading The Guardian and then all my favorite newspapers and magazines and scientific journals and still not be caught up. Nobody has the time, and we need to make sure that we make this information readily available. It's also, I mean, because I'm a journalist, I do know a fair bit about messaging and how you make messages land. And I think scientists also could use a bit of a helping hand with that in understanding how you pitch an idea. I mean, I watched that BBC documentary that you were part of, David, and looking at these families who are spending more money on medication for their epileptic children that come from cannabis than they're spending on their mortgage. How is this allowed?
Well, quite. That is another one. One of our major campaigns is we're girding our loins now to try to take that forward again, because there's still only 4 children
4
with getting prescriptions on the NHS. So I was speaking. We had a major meeting last week of people, the whole cannabis community, and one of the parents, Matt, was telling me that he thinks there might be maybe over nearly 2,000 children in Britain who would benefit, who are being denied access. Or
2,000,
thinks,
and there's only 4.
Yeah.
Also, people need to understand, if you get a prescription, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's free. And sometimes the cannabis medications, I cannot believe how expensive these things are.
Well, we need to get them on the NHS. But, I mean, I think maybe there are maybe 40 or 50 private ones now, but there's still many, many hundreds of children who are not getting access because the parents don't know how to do it, or doctors are refusing. Doctors are telling them, no, I wouldn't do that,
Yeah. No, it's very often the latter, is the doctors refusing to talk about it. I could not believe how much they just shot me down when I wanted to talk about it. They shot me down when I wanted to talk about it after they were legalized for prescription, right? I mean, I have friends who have cannabis prescriptions for fibromyalgia, for example, and there's just a staunch refusal to speak to me was horrifying.
Yeah.
So how is a parent who's not a published author who can read scientific papers supposed to be able to deal with them?
Yes, well, quite. They often just give up, and the child suffers and probably dies as a result of not getting the best available therapy.
I mean, the Dravet syndrome is the main one, I believe, that can kill you, right?
Well, part of the problem is that many of the children have unknown syndromes. So that's then another excuse. Oh, well, we don't know if this syndrome would respond, so we won't prescribe. But the reality is, the parents now that are making the decisions. But of course, it's the cost implications are just enormous. And I don't know. I'd be really interested in any insights you might have as to how we can break this impasse where you've got doctors shoulder to shoulder trying to block access to something which can save children's lives. I think this is the worst medical scandal, apart from COVID, since the Bristol Heart scandal.
I actually agree with you. I really agree with you. And let's remember, we're not just talking about children with epilepsy. We're talking about chronic pain. We're talking about arthritis. We're talking about menopausal symptoms. We're talking about, in fact, actually, I decided to spend the afternoon at Breaking Convention last year, the conference on psychedelics. I decided to spend one afternoon that talks about cannabis, which, even though I've been smoking cannabis since I was 15, I thought, I don't know, just something in my heart just told me I should go. It really actually reawakened my understanding of and my love for that plant and all the things that it could do. And it's, with psychedelics, okay, all you have to do is see somebody go crazy once in a dangerous environment to have a bit of fear. But beyond getting too fat and playing too many video games and losing your ambition, there's nothing to fear with cannabis, except, I mean, there probably are some cases where people did have mental disorders triggered, and it's not everybody's favorite recreational drug, but in terms of its medical potential, it is completely and totally insane. But if you want to talk about messaging, like here's an example where people messed up with messaging. In New York, CBD, I think it was actually the New York Health Authority started to clamp down on restaurants and cafes that were putting CBD into drinks because they said, look, you told us it's not a drug, but now you're saying it's psychoactively important. It has all these healing properties. So which is it? Is it a drug or not? And people do need to be clear about their messaging. But yeah, in terms of cannabis, the lack of appreciation for just how many things it can help in so many different ways. It is a wonder drug. And when you see some of that footage, like Charlotte Fiji in America, and a tiny little girl who was having the most horrific amount of seizures, and then cannabis medication actually made her a healthy. It's just unbelievable that anybody could look at that and not wake up.
And yet they do. And they fall back on this argument of statistics and argument of randomization without understanding that, of course, every individual is a unique person. And if that child had failed on multiple treatments before, it was very unlikely to be a placebo, because otherwise she'd have responded to the others. But there's a desire not to know or not to accept. Yeah, I think that's actually a huge. I mean, again, that's something in your province, really, as a scientific journalist, trying to get people to understand that science isn't just about registering a drug. There are other ways of looking at evidence.
Totally. Completely. But the desire to be joyfully and proudly ignorant of the scientific method is a disease, and it's really common right now, and it's spreading. And it's spreading worse than COVID.
Well, the good news, I suppose, is what you, Zoe, fighting back.
I try. It is hard, though.
Well, yeah,
I try very hard, but it's also, I mean, what we need really is to establish an enlightened dictator, as Voltaire always put it. We need an enlightened dictator. Let's make it me. And one of the things that I'll do is I will ensure that all the tech companies either pay their taxes, and if they don't, I'll take it and I'm going to give all that money to things like education and the free press. And I'll make sure that publications like Scientific American or the New York Times or other newspapers that are behind paywalls become free for the public. Because right now we have a terrible situation when the best information online is paywalled.
Yes,
so then people can access any kind of crap they want that's free to read. And bless The Guardian for keeping their content free, but it's not easy for them. And we need to really rectify the access to information, because it's a threat to democracy.
Well, I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think we would all agree that the emergence, particularly of things like Fox News, which tried to commandeer the airwaves.
Did you know, by the way, most people don't even remember this about the history of Fox News. When the Fox network started off, before it became a Murdoch product and a mouthpiece for all the right-wing lunatics, it was mostly basically the black entertainment station. They had Arsenio Hall, a late-night TV show. Fox started off.
I did not know that.
Fox started off as being full of black entertainers, being kind of left-wing and counterculture, and then Murdoch bought it and turned it into this horror show we see today. So we really need to have a more astute understanding of the media and the new media. Did you see, for example, Zuckerberg being questioned by Congress, and Congress did not understand a thing about what Facebook was or what he did? It's just a horror show. But the number one thing I think every democracy should have, whether you're an American, a left-winger, or a right-winger, we should have good education and good health care for children, because lots of kids grow up in homes with no books, with parents who just watch TV and don't care. And if you don't want to pay for the education, or if you don't want to pay for the health care, say, of somebody your own age who doesn't make enough money, that's, I think, horrific. But can't we all agree that every child should get off to the right start in the same way, with good schools and good education? Can we just have that?
Well, I'm going to fully endorse that sentiment. If I can help you achieve that, we will. I'll stick to my slightly more limited ambition of having a more rational approach to drugs that can help.
I know. Well, if you want me to lend a helping hand in any way for the cannabis campaigns, I certainly know that Chelsea Leyland, who bought so she made a film called Separating the Strain. So she has epilepsy, and so does her little sister, but her sister's is very severe, and the doctors are refusing to consider cannabis medications for her, just refuse to talk about it. And people don't understand, not having access to cannabis can kill you and destroy your life. I'm not being hyperbolic.
Well, we will, but we being the drug science, we are in the process of being part of a campaign. We're not entirely sure how best to play it, whether it's through legal channels or through media channels. But thank you for your offers, Zoe. And I would definitely, since I know where you live and I know what I shall be in touch. And
awesome.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And
oh gosh, thank you for having me.
When your book's ready, you come back and share it with us, will you?
I will, thank you. And check out the Mesh podcast if you want to hear more of me yapping about science and art.
There you go, the Mesh podcast.
Okay, thanks, David. You guys have a good day.
Thanks, Zoe. Take care. Bye-bye.